The morning sun cast long shadows across the university campus as students hurried to their classes, clutching coffee cups and checking their phones. Among them walked a figure that seemed out of place, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and worn clothing that had seen better days. His name was Dr. Marcus Chen, though nobody on this campus knew that. To them, he was just another homeless person who occasionally wandered through the prestigious grounds of Riverside University. Marcus paused outside the imposing brick building that housed the economics department. Through the large windows, he could see students filing into lecture halls, their eager faces reminding him of a time when he stood at the front of similar rooms, sharing his passion for economic theory and social justice. That felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 2 years since his world had completely fallen apart. He reached into his weathered backpack and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with equations and theoretical models that would have impressed any economics professor. Marcus had been working on a revolutionary approach to understanding poverty economics, drawing from his own recent experiences living on the streets. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent decades studying poverty from the comfort of his Oxford office, and now he was experiencing it firsthand. A group of students walked past, laughing loudly about their weekend plans. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, noticed Marcus sitting on the bench nearby. She nudged her friend Emma and whispered, "Look at that homeless guy. What's he doing here? Security should really do something about people like him hanging around campus." Emma glanced over and wrinkled her nose. "Probably looking for food or money. My dad always says these people choose to live this way. If they really wanted to work, they could find jobs." Marcus heard their conversation but didn't react. He had grown accustomed to such comments over the past months. People saw his appearance, the overgrown beard, the clothes that needed washing, the shoes held together with tape, and immediately made assumptions about his character, his intelligence, and his worth as a human being. The truth was far more complicated. Dr. Marcus Chen had been a respected professor at Oxford University for over 20 years. He had published numerous papers on economic inequality and had been considered one of the leading voices in his field. His life had been comfortable, predictable, and intellectually fulfilling. He owned a beautiful home in Oxford, drove a reliable car, and had a retirement fund that would have ensured his golden years were worry-free. Everything changed when his wife, Helen, was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. The NHS covered basic treatment, but the experimental therapies that might save her life were available only in the United States, at costs that insurance wouldn't cover. Without hesitation, Marcus had mortgaged their home, liquidated their savings, and taken out loans to pay for her treatment. For 18 months, they lived in a small apartment near the hospital in Boston, spending every penny they had on medical bills. Helen fought bravely, but the cancer ultimately won. Marcus found himself not only devastated by grief, but also completely bankrupt. The medical bills had consumed everything. To make matters worse, during his absence from Oxford, budget cuts had eliminated his position. At 58 years old, he was alone, broke, and professionally displaced in a foreign country. Pride had prevented him from reaching out to former colleagues for help. How could he explain that the man who had written extensively about economic safety nets had fallen through every crack in the system? Instead, he had remained in the United States, taking odd jobs when he could find them, sleeping in shelters when they had space, and gradually sinking deeper into the invisible world of homelessness. That morning at Riverside University, Marcus wasn't there by accident. He had heard through the homeless community grapevine that the university sometimes hired temporary lecturers for their continuing education programs. It was a long shot, but he thought perhaps he could offer to teach a class in exchange for a meal and maybe a small payment. As he sat on the bench, gathering courage to approach the administration building, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. Two professors were discussing the upcoming Economics Week, an annual event where the department invited speakers to discuss various economic topics with students and faculty. "We're still short a speaker for Thursday," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the department head. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp features and an authoritative manner. "Professor Rodriguez canceled at the last minute, and we haven't found a replacement." Her colleague, Dr. Robert Kim, shook his head in frustration. What about the topic? Wasn't he supposed to speak about poverty economics and social mobility? Yes, and it's particularly important given the current economic climate. Our students need to understand these issues, especially since many of them come from privileged backgrounds and have never really thought about economic inequality in practical terms. Marcus felt his heart race. This was exactly his area of expertise. Before his world collapsed, he had been working on groundbreaking research about the psychological and economic barriers that kept people trapped in poverty. His recent experiences had given him insights that no amount of academic study could provide. As the professors walked away, still discussing their dilemma, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He stood up, straightened his shoulders, and began walking toward the administration building. He would offer to speak about poverty economics, not as Dr. Marcus Chen of Oxford, but simply as someone who had lived it. The receptionist at the economics department was a young man named Kevin who looked up from his computer with barely concealed disdain when Marcus approached the desk. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather not. "I'd like to speak with Dr. Walsh about the speaker position for Economics Week," Marcus said quietly. Kevin looked him up and down, taking in the worn clothes and unkempt appearance. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. This is the economics department of a major university. We're not a social services office." "I understand that," Marcus replied patiently. "I'm here about the vacant speaking slot for Thursday. I have extensive knowledge about poverty economics and social mobility." Kevin actually laughed. "Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but professors don't just walk in off the street, especially not." He gestured vaguely at Marcus's appearance. "Especially not people who look like me," Marcus finished quietly. "I didn't say that," Kevin backpedaled, but his meaning was clear. "It's just that we have very strict qualifications for our speakers. They need advanced degrees, published research, university affiliations." "What if someone had those qualifications, but simply didn't look the part you expected?" Kevin was growing impatient. "Look, if you need help, there's a homeless shelter about 10 blocks from here. They serve lunch at noon, but you can't just hang around here bothering people." Marcus nodded slowly. He had expected this reaction, but it still stung. "What if I could prove to you that I'm qualified to speak about poverty economics?" "How exactly would you do that?" Kevin asked sarcastically. Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out his notebook. "What if I could show you economic models that demonstrate the correlation between educational access and intergenerational mobility? Or perhaps you'd be interested in seeing mathematical proofs of how credit accessibility affects small business development in underserved communities." Kevin glanced at the notebook dismissively. "Anyone can scribble numbers on paper. That doesn't make them an economist." At that moment, Dr. Walsh emerged from her office, having overheard part of the conversation. She looked at Marcus with curiosity rather than judgment. "What's the situation here, Kevin?" "This gentleman claims he wants to speak at Economics Week," Kevin explained, his tone making it clear what he thought of the idea. Dr. Walsh studied Marcus for a moment. Unlike her receptionist, she had spent enough time in academia to know that brilliance could come in unexpected packages. "What exactly did you want to propose?" she asked. "I'd like to offer my services as a speaker for Thursday's session on poverty economics. I have extensive experience in the field, both theoretical and practical." "Theoretical and practical?" Dr. Walsh raised an eyebrow. "I've spent years studying economic inequality from an academic perspective, and more recently, I've had the opportunity to experience it firsthand. I believe I could offer your students a unique perspective that combines rigorous economic analysis with real-world insights." Dr. Walsh was intrigued despite herself. "And your academic background?" Marcus hesitated. He could reveal his Oxford credentials, but something told him that wouldn't be the right approach. If he was going to do this, he wanted to earn the opportunity based on his knowledge and ideas, not his past reputation. "I have advanced degrees in economics, and I've published research in the field. But I'd prefer to let my ideas speak for themselves rather than rely on credentials." Kevin rolled his eyes. "Dr. Walsh, you're not seriously considering this." But Dr. Walsh was looking at Marcus's notebook, which he had left open on the counter. Even upside down, she could see that the equations and models were sophisticated and original. "May I see this?" Marcus handed her the notebook. As Dr. Walsh flipped through the pages, her expression changed from polite interest to genuine surprise. The work was not only academically sound, but showed insights she hadn't encountered in current literature. This is quite impressive, she said slowly. Where did you develop these models? Through observation and analysis of real-world economic patterns. When you're living in poverty, you develop a very practical understanding of how economic systems actually function versus how they're supposed to function. Dr. Walsh found herself in an unusual position. Every instinct told her this was highly irregular, but the quality of the work in front of her was undeniable. Kevin, could you give us some privacy? Kevin reluctantly returned to his desk, though he continued to watch the conversation with obvious disapproval. I have to ask, Dr. Walsh said quietly, are you currently homeless? Marcus met her gaze steadily. I am currently experiencing housing insecurity, yes, but that doesn't invalidate my understanding of economics. In fact, it has given me insights that I never could have gained from purely academic study. Dr. Walsh was faced with a decision that could either be brilliantly innovative or spectacularly disastrous. If I were to consider this, what exactly would you propose to teach our students? I'd want to show them how economic theory plays out in the real world, how the unemployment benefit cliff actually traps people in poverty, how the lack of stable addresses creates barriers to employment that economists rarely factor into their models, how the psychology of scarcity affects decision-making in ways that traditional economic theory doesn't account for. As Marcus spoke, Dr. Walsh realized she was listening to insights that could fundamentally change how her students understood economics. This man, regardless of his current circumstances, clearly had a deep and nuanced understanding of economic systems. The challenge, she said carefully, is that our students and faculty have certain expectations about speakers. The optics of having someone who appears to be homeless address the economics department could be problematic. Marcus nodded. I understand. What if we structured it differently? Instead of a traditional lecture, what if you presented it as an innovative teaching experiment? A chance for students to engage with economic theory through the lens of lived experience. Dr. Walsh found herself warming to the idea. It would certainly be unique, and it might teach her privileged students something they couldn't learn from textbooks. There would be conditions, she said. You'd need to present your credentials privately to me before I could approve this, and the format would need to be carefully structured. I understand. And Kevin raises a valid point about qualifications. Our speakers typically have university affiliations and published work. Marcus reached into another part of his backpack and pulled out a worn manila folder. Inside were photocopies of some of his published papers from his Oxford days. He handed them to Dr. Walsh. As she read the author names and institutional affiliations, her eyes widened. Dr. Marcus Chen, Oxford University. She looked up at him with new understanding. This is you. Marcus nodded. It is, but I'd prefer that information remain between us for now. I want the opportunity to succeed or fail based on the value of what I have to say, not on past accomplishments. Dr. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had learned. Here was a man who had been one of the most respected economists in his field, now living on the streets but still pursuing his passion for economic understanding. It was both tragic and inspiring. All right, she said finally. Let's try something unconventional, but we'll need to plan this carefully. As they began to discuss the details, neither of them noticed the small group of students who had been listening from around the corner, including Sarah and Emma, the two who had made dismissive comments earlier. They had heard enough to know that the homeless guy was somehow going to be speaking to their class, and they were already planning to make their displeasure known. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everyone's assumptions about knowledge, worth, and the true meaning of education. The news of Thursday's unconventional speaker spread through the economics department like wildfire. By Tuesday evening, every student in the program had heard some version of the story about Dr. Walsh's decision to allow a homeless man to address their class. The reactions ranged from curiosity to outright indignation. Sarah Martinez sat in the student lounge with her study group, her voice rising with each word. I can't believe they're actually going through with this. My parents pay $50,000 a year for me to get an education from qualified professors, not to listen to some vagrant who probably never even finished high school. Her friend Jake nodded in agreement. It's embarrassing. What if word gets out to other universities? Riverside's reputation will be ruined. will be known as the school that lets homeless people pretend to be professors. Emma, who had been quiet during the discussion, finally spoke up. Maybe we should give him a chance. Dr. Walsh isn't stupid. She must have a reason for approving this. The reason is political correctness gone mad, Sarah snapped. Everyone's so afraid of being called discriminatory that they've lost all common sense. Next thing you know, they'll be letting panhandlers teach mathematics. Word of the controversial speaker had also reached the faculty lounge, where opinions were equally divided. Dr. Robert Kim, Dr. Walsh's colleague, cornered her near the coffee machine on Wednesday morning. Jennifer, I need to understand your thinking here. The department is buzzing with rumors, and frankly, I'm concerned about the potential backlash. Dr. Walsh sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Robert, have you ever considered that some of our most important insights might come from unexpected sources? Of course, but there are protocols, standards. We have a responsibility to maintain academic rigor. And what if I told you that this speaker has more real-world economic experience than most of our faculty combined? What if his insights could fundamentally change how our students understand the subject they're studying? Dr. Kim looked skeptical. Jennifer, I respect your judgment, but this feels like a dangerous gamble. If this goes badly, it reflects on all of us. Meanwhile, Marcus spent Wednesday night in the university library, one of the few places where he could stay warm and work on his presentation without being asked to leave. The night security guard, an older man named Frank, had grown accustomed to seeing Marcus there and had stopped questioning his presence. Working late again? Frank asked during his rounds. Preparing for tomorrow, Marcus replied, looking up from his notes. Frank glanced at the complex diagrams and equations spread across the table. You studying for something? Marcus smiled quietly. In a way, I'm giving a lecture tomorrow about poverty economics. Frank raised an eyebrow. Really, where at? Here at the university. Frank studied Marcus more carefully. He had noticed that this particular homeless man was different from others who sometimes sought shelter in the library. He spoke educated English, his notes were sophisticated, and he treated the books with the reverence of someone who understood their value. You know, Frank said, I've been working security here for 15 years. I've seen a lot of professors come and go. Most of them couldn't explain their work to a regular person if their lives depended on it. But something tells me you could. Thank you, Frank. That means more than you know. As Thursday morning arrived, Marcus made his way to the campus early. He had managed to clean up somewhat at a shelter's bathroom facility, trimming his beard and washing as best he could. His clothes were still worn, but they were clean. He carried his notes in a borrowed briefcase that one of the shelter volunteers had given him. Dr. Walsh met him outside the lecture hall at 9:30 a.m. The class was scheduled to begin at 10:00, and she wanted to brief him on what to expect. I won't lie to you, she said. There's been significant resistance to this. Some students are planning to walk out, and a few have complained to the administration. Marcus nodded. I expected that. What matters is reaching the ones who are willing to listen. I've structured this as an experimental seminar rather than a traditional lecture. I'll introduce you as a guest speaker with extensive practical experience in poverty economics. I won't mention Oxford unless you decide to reveal that yourself. I appreciate that. I want to earn their attention, not command it through past credentials. As they entered the lecture hall, Marcus could feel the tension immediately. About 40 students were seated throughout the room, and their body language spoke volumes. Some sat with arms crossed and expressions of skeptical disdain. Others looked curious but cautious. A few appeared openly hostile. Sarah sat in the front row with several of her friends, their notebooks conspicuously closed. She had decided to make her displeasure known through passive resistance. Behind her, Emma sat with her notebook open, though she looked uncertain about what to expect. Dr. Walsh stepped to the podium. Good morning, everyone. Today's seminar represents something of an experiment in experiential learning. Our guest speaker brings a unique perspective to poverty economics, one that combines theoretical knowledge with real-world experience. She gestured toward Marcus. I'd like you to approach this session with open minds. Sometimes our most profound learning comes from sources we don't initially expect. As Marcus walked to the front of the room, he could hear whispered comments from the students. This is ridiculous. I can't believe we have to sit through this. My dad's going to flip when he hears about this. Marcus stood at the podium for a moment, looking out at the sea of skeptical faces. He had addressed much larger audiences at academic conferences, but he had never faced an audience that questioned his right to be there before he had even spoken. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the hostility he could feel. "I want to start by acknowledging what many of you are probably thinking. You're wondering what a homeless man could possibly teach you about economics. You're questioning whether this is a legitimate use of your time and your tuition money." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. He had articulated exactly what she was thinking. "Those are fair questions," Marcus continued, "and I hope to answer them not through credentials or appeals to authority, but through the content of what I share with you today." He moved away from the podium, choosing to walk among the students rather than lecturing from a distance. "How many of you have studied the economic concept of rational choice theory?" Most hands went up reluctantly. And according to rational choice theory, individuals always make decisions that maximize their economic benefit, correct? Nods around the room. "So let me pose a question. If that's true, why would someone choose to be homeless? According to rational choice theory, homelessness should be virtually impossible because any rational person would make whatever choices necessary to secure housing." The room grew quieter. This wasn't what they had expected. Marcus walked to the whiteboard and began writing equations. "Let's examine this mathematically. If we define utility as U equals F, housing, food, healthcare, employment, and we assume rational actors seeking to maximize utility, then homelessness should be an impossible outcome." Emma found herself leaning forward, intrigued despite her earlier skepticism. But clearly, homelessness exists. So either rational choice theory is fundamentally flawed, or there are variables in the equation that traditional economic models don't account for. Marcus began writing additional variables on the board. What if we add factors like credit score requirements for housing, background check barriers for employment, the cost of maintaining a stable address for job applications? Jake, one of Sarah's friends, raised his hand skeptically. "But those are just excuses. If someone really wants to work, they can overcome those obstacles." Marcus nodded. "That's a common belief. Let me give you a practical example. Suppose you're looking for a job, you need an address for applications, but you can't get housing without proof of income. You need income to get housing, but you need housing to get income. This is what economists call a coordination failure." He wrote out the mathematical proof on the board, showing how the system could trap individuals in suboptimal outcomes despite their best rational efforts. Now add other variables. Suppose you have a medical bankruptcy in your past through no fault of your own, perhaps a family member's illness. Your credit score is destroyed. You can't get traditional housing, so you're forced into week-to-week motels that cost more per month than a regular apartment would. The room was growing more attentive. Even Sarah had unconsciously opened her notebook. "The weekly motel costs consume so much of your income that you can't save for a deposit on real housing. You're trapped in what behavioral economists call a poverty trap, a situation where rational choices at each step lead to irrational outcomes overall." Marcus drew a complex diagram showing the interconnected economic factors that could trap someone in poverty, despite their best efforts to escape. Dr. Walsh, watching from the back of the room, realized that what she was witnessing was extraordinary. Marcus wasn't just explaining economic theory. He was revealing how it actually functioned in the real world, with insights that could only come from lived experience. A student named Alex raised his hand. "But wouldn't government assistance programs prevent those kinds of traps?" Marcus smiled grimly. "That's an excellent question. Let's examine the mathematics of government assistance." He turned to a fresh section of the whiteboard. Most assistance programs have what's called a benefits cliff. For example, if you earn more than a certain amount per month, you lose eligibility for food assistance, housing vouchers, and healthcare subsidies all at once. He wrote out the equations showing how earning an additional dollar in income could result in losing hundreds of dollars in benefits. So a rational economic actor faced with this choice would logically refuse a promotion or additional hours that would push them over the benefits cliff. They're not being lazy. They're being perfectly rational within an irrational system. The room was now completely quiet, with students frantically taking notes. "This is why traditional economic models fail to predict or explain poverty," Marcus continued. They assume perfect information and smooth utility curves, but the reality is full of discontinuities and perverse incentives. Emma raised her hand tentatively. So how would you fix it? That's the right question, Marcus said, his eyes lighting up. Classical economics suggests that information and opportunity should be sufficient, but behavioral economics shows us that cognitive load, the mental energy required just to survive, actually impairs decision-making ability. He began explaining his original research on scarcity psychology, how the constant stress of poverty literally changes brain function in ways that make escaping poverty more difficult. Sarah, who had planned to walk out, found herself drawn into the discussion despite herself. This wasn't what she had expected at all. The homeless man was presenting economic theories she had never heard before, backed by mathematical models that were more sophisticated than anything in their textbook. But wait, Jake interrupted. If you understand all this theory, why haven't you solved your own situation? The question hung in the air, and Marcus paused for a moment. It was the question he had been expecting, the one that cut to the heart of everything. That, he said quietly, is perhaps the most important question you could ask, and it illustrates the difference between understanding a system and having the resources to navigate it successfully. He returned to the whiteboard one more time. Let me show you the economic reality of escaping homelessness when you're already in the system. What he wrote next would shock every person in that room and fundamentally change how they understood the relationship between knowledge, circumstances, and opportunity. The transformation of the classroom was about to become complete, but not in the way anyone had expected when the day began. Marcus turned to face the class, his expression serious but not defensive. Jake's question about why he couldn't solve his own situation had created a moment of profound, teachable opportunity. To answer your question honestly, Marcus began, let me show you the economic mathematics of being homeless in America, even when you have knowledge and skills. He drew a timeline on the whiteboard. Day 1, you lose your housing. Maybe it's medical bankruptcy, job loss, or in my case, spending everything on a loved one's medical care. You now have zero savings, no permanent address, and no credit. The classroom was completely silent now. Even Sarah had stopped pretending to be disinterested. Day 2, you need a job, but every application requires an address and phone number. You can't use the homeless shelter's address because many employers automatically reject those applications. You could rent a PO box, but that costs money you don't have. Marcus wrote out the costs on the board. PO box, $60 per month. Prepaid phone, $40 per month. Interview clothes, minimum $100. Transportation to interviews, variable but significant. Total startup cost just to look for work, $200 minimum. Emma raised her hand. But couldn't you borrow that from someone? From whom? Marcus asked gently. When you're homeless, you quickly discover who your real friends are. Most people are uncomfortable with your situation. They worry you'll ask them for money or want to stay at their house. Social networks disappear remarkably quickly. He continued with his timeline. Day 30. Suppose you somehow overcome these barriers and get a job interview. You're competing against candidates with stable housing, professional references, and recent work history. Your explanation for your gap in employment, I was caring for my dying wife, makes employers uncomfortable. They worry about your emotional stability and future reliability. Dr. Walsh watched from the back of the room as her students grappled with these realities. This was exactly the kind of learning experience she had hoped for, but even she was surprised by how effectively Marcus was challenging their assumptions. Day 60, let's say you actually get hired for a minimum wage job. You're earning $800 per month, but you still can't qualify for housing because you need first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit, typically 3 months' rent up front. That's $2,400 for a basic apartment. Marcus wrote the equation on the board. Monthly income, $800. Basic survival costs, food, transportation, phone, laundry, $600 equals available savings, $200 per month. At $200 saved per month, it would take you 12 months to save enough for housing, assuming no emergencies. But you can't maintain a job for 12 months without stable housing, because sleeping in shelters means you can't guarantee you'll be well-rested and clean for work every day. Alex, who had been skeptical earlier, raised his hand. What about government assistance? Marcus smiled grimly. Excellent question. Let's examine that. He drew another set of calculations. To qualify for housing assistance, you typically need to be on a waiting list for 6 months to 2 years. To qualify for food assistance, you need an address, which you don't have. To qualify for job training programs, you need stable housing, which you can't get without a job. He connected the various requirements with arrows, showing how each program required something the others provided, creating an impossible loop. This is what economists call a coordination failure: multiple systems that work individually, but fail catastrophically when someone needs to access them simultaneously. Sarah, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with how her preconceptions were being challenged, finally spoke up. But you're obviously educated. Couldn't you just explain your situation to someone and get help? Marcus paused, recognizing this as a crucial teaching moment. That's a fascinating question because it reveals an assumption about how our economic systems work. You're suggesting that human capital, knowledge, and skills should automatically translate into economic opportunity. He wrote human capital not equal to economic opportunity on the board. In classical economic theory, that should be true. But in reality, there are information asymmetries and signaling problems. When I walk into a job interview looking homeless, my appearance signals unreliability before I can demonstrate my knowledge. It's what economists call statistical discrimination. Marcus began telling them about his attempts to find work. I applied for teaching positions at community colleges, but without a permanent address or professional references, my applications were rejected automatically. I offered to teach for free at adult education centers, but they were concerned about liability issues. I tried tutoring, but parents weren't comfortable having someone who appeared homeless in their homes. I attempted freelance economic consulting, but without an office or professional appearance, I couldn't attract clients. Jake looked confused. But couldn't you just clean up, get some decent clothes? With what money? Marcus asked. Remember, I started with zero resources. A professional haircut costs $20. Interview clothes cost $100 minimum. A gym membership for shower access costs $30 per month. These seem like small amounts until you're earning $0 per month. Emma was taking furious notes. This is like a real-life case study in market failure, she murmured. Exactly, Marcus said, pleased that she was making the connection. Traditional economic models assume that market's clear, that supply meets demand efficiently. But when you're homeless, you're essentially locked out of the labor market despite having valuable human capital to offer. He turned to a fresh section of the whiteboard. Let me show you something that might surprise you. I've been developing a new economic model based on my experiences. What he wrote next was a sophisticated mathematical framework that incorporated psychological factors, social capital, and institutional barriers into traditional economic equations. Dr. Walsh found herself leaning forward. Even with her economics PhD, she was having trouble following some of the more advanced mathematical concepts Marcus was presenting. This model predicts that temporary economic shocks can create permanent displacement from the labor market, even for highly skilled individuals. It's what I call the economic gravity well. The deeper you fall into poverty, the more energy it takes to escape, until eventually escape becomes mathematically impossible without external intervention. A student named Lisa raised her hand. Is that what happened to you? You fell into this gravity well. Marcus nodded. After my wife died, I found myself with no assets, no income, and no way to signal my qualifications to potential employers. Each day homeless made it harder to get back into the system. It's like compound interest, but in reverse. Sarah, who had been following the mathematical proofs despite herself, asked, So how do you escape? What's the solution? That's the trillion-dollar question, Marcus replied. Individual solutions require what economists call external shocks, someone willing to take a risk on you despite your circumstances. Systemic solutions require redesigning our safety net programs to eliminate coordination failures. He began outlining policy recommendations that were more innovative than anything the students had encountered in their coursework. Universal basic income, housing-first policies, and job guarantee programs, all backed by mathematical models showing their potential effectiveness. As Marcus spoke, something remarkable was happening in the classroom. The students who had entered the room seeing only a homeless man were now recognizing a brilliant economist whose insights surpassed those of many tenured professors. Emma whispered to her friend, "This is some of the most sophisticated economic analysis I've ever heard." Jake, who had been among the most skeptical, raised his hand. "I have to ask, what's your background? Where did you learn this?" Marcus paused. He had been hopping to avoid this moment, but he realized that his credibility with these students now depended on honesty. "I spent 23 years as a professor of economics at Oxford University. I published extensively on poverty economics and social mobility. Before my wife's illness, I was considered one of the leading voices in behavioral economics." The room erupted. Students looked at each other in shock, some embarrassed by their earlier assumptions, others amazed by what they had just witnessed. "You're Dr. Marcus Chen?" Alex asked in disbelief. "I read your paper on poverty traps last semester." Sarah felt her face burning with shame as she remembered her comments from earlier in the week. She had dismissed one of the world's leading economists as a vagrant who probably hadn't finished high school. Dr. Walsh stepped forward from the back of the room. "I think this is an appropriate time for me to add some context. Dr. Chen approached me earlier this week, not seeking charity or special treatment, but offering to share his knowledge with our students. Despite his circumstances, he has continued to conduct original research that pushes the boundaries of economic understanding." Marcus looked around the room at the stunned faces of the students. "I revealed my background not to seek sympathy or to shame anyone for their initial reactions. Those reactions are perfectly rational given the information you had. But I wanted to demonstrate something important about human capital and economic signaling." He pointed to the equations still covering the whiteboard. "Everything I taught you today, I knew 3 months ago when I was sleeping in a park. My knowledge didn't change based on my circumstances. What changed was your willingness to listen to that knowledge based on how I appeared." Emma raised her hand tentatively. "So all those times people walked past you on campus?" "I was the same person with the same knowledge, yes. The only thing that changed was your perception based on external circumstances." The implications of what Marcus was saying began to sink in. How many brilliant minds were being overlooked because they didn't fit expected patterns? How many solutions to complex problems were going unheard because the people proposing them didn't have the right credentials or appearance? Sarah finally found the courage to speak. "Dr. Chen, I owe you an apology. I said some horrible things about you earlier this week." Marcus shook his head gently. "You responded rationally to the information you had. That's not something to apologize for. But I hope this experience will make you think twice about dismissing ideas based on their source rather than their merit." Jake raised his hand again. "What happens now? I mean, you've just given us one of the most eye-opening lectures of our academic careers. Are you going back to sleeping in shelters?" Dr. Walsh stepped forward again. "Actually, that's something Dr. Chen and I discussed before class. Riverside University has an opening for a visiting professor of applied economics. If Dr. Chen is interested, I'd like to recommend him for the position." The class erupted in applause. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes, the first time he had allowed himself to feel hope in months. "There's one condition," Dr. Walsh continued with a slight smile. "The position requires teaching undergraduate courses on poverty economics. I hope that's something you'd be comfortable with." Marcus looked out at the classroom full of students who had gone from dismissing him to hanging on his every word. "I think I could manage that," he said quietly. As the class ended and students filed out, many stopped to shake Marcus's hand or ask questions about his research. Sarah approached him hesitantly. "Dr. Chen, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak to my economics club about this experience. I think a lot of students need to hear what you shared today." "I'd be honored," Marcus replied. Emma lingered as well. "I know this might sound presumptuous, but I'm working on my senior thesis about economic mobility. Would you consider being my advisor?" Marcus smiled. "I'd like that very much." As the room emptied, Dr. Walsh approached Marcus. "You know, when you first walked into my office, I thought I was taking a risk on you. Now I realize you were taking a much bigger risk on us." "How so?" "You trusted a group of privileged students and faculty to look past appearances and recognize knowledge for what it is. That took remarkable courage." Marcus gathered his notes from the whiteboard. The same equations that had seemed like the scribblings of a vagrant just hours earlier and now represented cutting-edge economic research. Dr. Walsh, before I accept your offer, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same professor I was at Oxford. This experience has changed me, deepened my understanding in ways I couldn't have imagined. I'm a better economist now because I've lived the theories I used to only study. That's exactly why I want you here, she replied. Our students need professors who understand that economics isn't just abstract theory. It's about real people making real decisions under real constraints. As they walked out of the lecture hall together, Marcus reflected on the remarkable turn his life had taken. 3 hours earlier, he had been a homeless man hopping to trade knowledge for a meal. Now he was a professor again, but more importantly, he had helped a group of students understand that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. The campus looked different to him now as they walked across the quad. Students hurried past, focused on their phones and conversations. But Marcus found himself wondering what stories each of them carried, what knowledge they possessed that might be overlooked because it didn't come in expected packages. Frank, the security guard, was doing his rounds near the library when he spotted Marcus walking with Dr. Walsh. He approached them with a puzzled expression. "Hey, Professor," he called to Marcus, "how did that lecture go?" Dr. Walsh looked surprised. "You knew about this?" Frank grinned. "I've been watching this guy work in our library for months. I could tell he was something special, just didn't know exactly what." Marcus smiled. "Frank believed in me before I believed in myself again." "Sometimes it takes an outsider to see what everyone else is missing," Frank replied with a shrug. As the weeks passed, Marcus's story spread throughout the university and beyond. News outlets picked up the story of the homeless professor, but Marcus was careful to steer the narrative away from his personal circumstances toward the larger economic issues he had identified. His first official class as a Riverside professor was standing room only, with students from other departments auditing the course. But Marcus had learned something important from his initial lecture. The most powerful teaching moments came not from his credentials or his dramatic personal story, but from his ability to help students see familiar concepts in entirely new ways. Sarah became one of his most dedicated students, eventually changing her major from business to economics with a focus on social policy. Emma's senior thesis, written under Marcus's guidance, won the university's award for outstanding undergraduate research. Jake started a student organization focused on addressing homelessness in the local community, approaching it not as a charity project, but as a complex economic problem requiring systematic solutions. Dr. Walsh often reflected on the risk she had taken in allowing Marcus to speak to her class. It had turned out to be one of the best decisions of her academic career, not just because she had discovered a brilliant colleague, but because it had reminded her why she had become an educator in the first place. Marcus never forgot the lessons of his time on the streets, and he made sure his students didn't either. He required each of them to volunteer at local homeless shelters, not to provide charity, but to conduct field research for their economic analysis papers. "Economics," he would tell them, "is not about numbers on a whiteboard. It's about understanding how real people navigate systems that can either support them or trap them. If our models can't account for that reality, then we need better models." The man who had once been dismissed as just another homeless person asking for handouts had become one of the university's most popular professors. But more importantly, he had shown an entire generation of students that knowledge and wisdom could come from the most unexpected places, if only they were willing to listen. Marcus kept his small apartment near campus simple and modest. He had learned to value experiences over possessions, relationships over status symbols. Every morning when he walked across campus to his office, he remembered what it felt like to be invisible, and he made sure to see and acknowledge every person he encountered, regardless of their circumstances. His research continued to break new ground, incorporating insights from his lived experience of poverty into sophisticated economic models. Other universities began adopting his teaching methods, recognizing that experiential learning could provide insights that traditional academic approaches missed. But perhaps his greatest contribution was simpler than his mathematical models or policy recommendations. Marcus had shown that the line between professor and student, between expert and learner, between the housed and the homeless, was far thinner than anyone had imagined. In a world that often judged people by their appearances rather than their ideas, Marcus Chen had proven that true knowledge transcends circumstances, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the people society is most likely to overlook. The student who had once asked, "May I teach for a meal?" had reminded an entire university that learning, at its best, is always a mutual exchange, and that the most valuable lessons often come from the places we least expect to find them.